What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoners Rift Team's live pod. I'm here to talk to you about patch 25.S1.3. No big preamble here. Let's get into the content of the patch itself. First and foremost, the big headliner here is we are buffing the global attack speed cap by 20% from 2.5 to 3.0. There is a theoretical max AS cap we really want to give you, especially on the average case, because we don't want the default state of late game champions to be unwieldy. There is a mechanical ceiling we want to put on the average AD carry here. Obviously, Jhin won't ever hit it, but some champions do, and some champions break it on purpose, and that's fine. But there is a maximum amount we would want to do here. Now, I want to be clear, 20%, like potentially 20% more auto attack damage is a very, very, very big deal. If that was a flat buff from level 1, that would be like 10% win rate worth of power. Obviously, this is not going to be the case in most games. It is very hard to hit the AS cap, but the theoretical cap is much, much higher. The theoretical late game carry potential of high attack speed AD carries is better. I think in general, it is the sort of attack speed on hit type champions that are going to be doing the best here. This is Varus and Kog'Maw and non-hopping Kalista Master Yi champs like this. But in general, hey, this is going to be a thing. It is, I think, going to be a reasonably big deal for late game feels. And a really quick aside about this is that I think over the years, League of Legends has slightly power crept over time, and the one system that hasn't really crept up to keep up with that is generic auto attack damage. AD carries have tended to be pushed more toward durability and spell damage, which is how we've gotten things like Lethality Jinx, because that's where we were willing to put power budget. And so going back into some attack speed, I think, is good. Going back into auto attacks for the champions who are meant to be more auto attack focused is good. And overall, I think this will be a really positive thing for a lot of champions. Next thing is we are nerfing champion bounties on the losing team. So we explicitly built in levers for tuning champ bounties for the losing team, and we've buffed it I think once or twice now at this point, and we're tuning that lever, we're turning that knob, tuning that lever again. There is still more room to go if this still isn't enough, but this is just averaging it out. This is basically the bounty suppressing component is roughly twice as powerful, and so it'll be much less likely to have a bounty on your head if you're the lone carry on a losing team. Now, to be fair, if you're the carry and the game is close, it's just a close game. Yeah, it's sure you versus 5 people, but the game is still close. You have to be explicitly losing in some combination of gold, XP, objectives, and whatnot for this to actually count. It can just be gold, but other things matter. So like, we're down 5k, but you're up 3 drakes to 0. You likely won't have this happen because you're not losing by that much. You're on soul point. But just pointing out that this mechanic existed. We added it on purpose to have a very easy to tune anti-bounty lever, and we're tuning it again because it's still too permissive of giving bounties to the losing team. We're taking a pretty big swing at epic monsters. This actually wasn't meant to be like, let's take a look at epics go. It was more, hey, in a bunch of individual sort of areas, we identified that Cloud Soul is the best soul by a lot. Chemtech Soul is the worst soul by a lot. Let's push them toward the center. It's understanding that Voracious Otacon is still doing a bit too much, and so we're nerfing I believe it's specifically the respawn duration on Voracious Otacon, so that there is meaningful downtime, such that after you win the quote-unquote team fight, you can pretty much safely recall and reset and be back on the map at the same time as your opponent, instead of them having the tempo advantage despite inting into you. And just overall identifying also that the top side of the map, we definitely added Void Grubs and wanted them to be strong in order to give top laners essentially something to fight over and feel good about. The overall power level of Grubs is too high. And to be fair, there is some more long-term work that should be done to Void Grubs here to make them sort of more fair across the game. In probably the next few patches, there will be some other sets of changes to Void Grubs. They're going to matter. It's going to be meaningful. That work hasn't started as of today, but it will probably relatively soon. And again, next few patches, we'll probably see something. Again, work hasn't started, so if this ends up being really low scope, it could be in 0.4. If it's really, really high scope, it could be like 0.7. But regardless, this is something that we are planning on looking at. And either way, there's just a pretty small nerf to Void Grubs here. So this is just the dot damage going down on the camp, basically. Next up, we understand that basically all the domination users are in a pretty bad spot. The generic win rate of these runes is down about 1.25%. We can pretty cleanly compare patch over patch. Like, what is the win rate of anyone going electrocute in 0.24 to 0.2? Oh, it's down this much win rate. Okay, we should buff. And so the thing is, I guess I've already said it, but the reason the new runes exist is to give a more like high coordinated skewed output to domination tree rune trees, understanding that things like Eyeball Collector are not very good in pro, but being able to spot and destroy wards and have better vision is really good in pro. And so it's a slight re-architecting of typical domination champions to make them better in pro play, because we basically don't see pros play assassins at all. And it'd be cool to loosen that up some, right? And a lot of times when they do it, they would just go Conqueror, because they would have to take Eyeball Collector, which just couldn't do anything for them, right? And neither Zombie Ward nor Ghost Poro actually made sense for mid laners at all, so they had kind of a dead rune slot. So mentioned that before, mentioning it again, that's the point here. But of course, most players cannot get nearly that much value out of vision, very understandable. And so we can basically make up that win rate gap by still allowing there to be a strong choice between Electrocute and First Strike, or Electrocute and Conqueror, or Dark Harvest and Comet, or whatever, and just bring them up to snuff so that they are equivalent rune choices. And so we're aiming at about 1.25% of win rate, purely thrust into the keystones. Now, that is a lot of power. There's some really large buffs. In most of these cases, the total throughput of the rune is up by around 40% at level 1. That is a lot more rune per rune. They're tending to fall off over time. The sort of point of all these domination choices is that they are early game runes with some risk to them. The Dark Harvest risk is that it doesn't level scale at all. It's purely based on how many more stacks you can get to keep up against what would otherwise be level scaling. In the case of Electrocute, it just is really front loaded. The level 1 buff is 40%. The level 18 buff is around 25%. It is a front loaded buff. You'll run Electrocute so that you can lane bully. That's what it's going to be there for. We'll see if it's too good in pro play and that's all they run. Okay, we'll have to peel some stuff back a little bit and kind of do the right choices there. But for now, it's some intentional shaping towards, especially when you compare assassin to assassin and you say, like, well, what does Conqueror do? That's much more of a team fight and sort of long fight kind of thing. What does First Strike do? Oh, it's a greedy rune where you're going to farm gold in lane and then have good damage late game. Electrocute is about killing your opponent in lane. So again, kind of a strong set of comparisons there. And we are also nerfing 2 of the support items. Bloodsong has long been really, really overpowered. It has been consistently heavily underpurchased, which I don't know what to say. People are really, really slow to buy the actual right items here. If you track by time and track by MMR, right, more recent and higher skill players are more likely to buy Bloodsong, but it's a really slow process of players actually understanding it. Bloodsong is still, I think, the actual least built support item, despite being arguably the best on a large number of champions. And it's just a very, very slow process where this thing's been OP forever, and it's sort of like, well, we'll nerf it as perception catches up enough to be worthy to nerf. It's still the best support item in the game. We're slowly getting there because players are really slow to realize how good this thing is, but it is what it is. There's a Bloodsong nerf there. Zazax is more about just re-architecting the support landscape a bit more toward tanks and enchanters, slightly away from mages. It's just a very soft, slight power pull away from support overall, away from selfish supports and more towards supportive ones. This is a very light nudge towards agency going to other players in the game, right? This will mean slightly fewer Luxes and slightly fewer Zyras and slightly fewer Brands and slightly more Lulus. And just an overall like intentional nudge toward again, it's small, but is a nudge towards a slightly different sort of suite of champions played in that role. All right, let's go on to champions. We've got 9 individual champion buffs here. Now keep in mind, again, Electrocute buffs is a lot of win rate to a lot of champions. Dark Harvest buffs and Halo Blades buffs a lot to a lot of champions. Oh, I actually forgot to bring up what the actual Halo Blades buff was here. Halo Blades is specifically 2 seconds off the cooldown, and to melee champions only around 30% increased attack speed so that you can get even more aggressive burst out of it. Again, still meant to be an early game burst rune. We figured that the cooldown was much more ranged champions good. It's a lot easier for a ranged champion to make access to get use out of that cooldown. And so if the cooldown is up 25% more often, that's actually not that far apart from just being 25% more rune, period. And so we thought that for melee champions, though, the cooldown was not going to do that for them. And so we also buffed the actual throughput by about 25% as well. All right, finally now onto the champion buffs. Again, keep in mind there are a bunch of Domination Keystone buffs, so any champ that is tied to Domination Keystones is getting direct power here from, again, our expectation is between 1 and 1.5% win rate to each of those runes. So if your favorite champion's not here and they run Electrocute or Dark Harvest or Halo Blades, that's a buff, right? Evelynn is doing very, very poorly, and one thing that we really notice here is that Emax is Emax second is by far her most common option and is pretty clearly wrong against Wmax. I am still a fan of the intuitive maxes being correct. This was not meant to be like a big re-architecture of like pulling things out of W, pushing them back into E, whatever. It's like, hey, Evelynn has room for buffs. Most players, like 80% of Evelynn players, play E max second, and they're getting screwed for, maxing the other damage skill on an assassin. Like, this is intuitive. Of course, again, Evelynn means no, W is just better because E's rank up is trash. Let's make E's rank up not trash, please. And here's some power to Evelynn. So the vast majority of Evelynn gamers, Evelynn players, games with Evelynn, will get a lot of buff out of this because it's adding something like 5 to like 45 or so damage on this spell. It's really, really meaningful. And if you are an Evelynn one trick who's already maxing W, well, you're still getting Electrocute buffed, and you're still getting 5 flat damage on E, even if you are saving it till last, and you're only getting another 10 damage at level 14. Again, Electrocute is the big boost here for the ones who are doing, reasonably decent. And to be fair, like W second Evelynn is like only about 1.25% underpowered. That's the Electrocute buff, right? So this should put her in generally a pretty good spot. And then for people who are doing the kind of incorrect skill order, it'll be closer to the same as the correct skill order. So hopefully looks pretty good for Evelynn. Next up is Kayn. Kayn's Q rank up is actually very, very poor. The correct thing to do on Kayn is 3 points Q, then stop and go max W. Also worth noting that Rost does not use the base version of Q. And so, once you're level 4 or 3, depending on how you want to path, you are going to get, I think it's 10 more damage per rank up. I think it's 10 more damage per rank up. No, it's 5 damage per rank up, but it's double hits, right? So it's kind of 20, aka, kind of like a lot, right, of damage per rank on Q. But regardless, normal Kayn holds this forever. Blue Kayn holds this forever. Red Kayn gets off this, so it's going to be a much smaller Red Kayn buff. But ultimately, Kayn's Q rank up is actually pretty bad. It barely doubles its damage output by maxing it, which is generally speaking a fairly weak max. There's a reason correct Blue Kayn play is to stop at 3, then go max W once you're there and you're happy by level 10. But hey, let's let Q max be reasonable. This rank up is, I think, just simply too shallow. And again, it is a buff that specifically only really helps base Kayn, which is trash. It's fine. You eventually evolve, and Blue Kayn, who is doing really poorly right now. Jax is getting a slew of sort of fighter-focused buffs, trying to make sure he is good at sustained combat and, does not become a burst mage. There's been quite a bit of talk internally around how healthy Zhonya's is in this champion. The idea of him having AP ratios would say, hey, you can play fighter sustained Jax, but you can also try to play AP burst Jax as an alternate possibility. There's players who play, of course, quite a bit of AP Jax out there. The tough thing is, because he has good AP ratios, he just buys Zhonya's as just Jax overall, and then has suddenly a bunch of burst on a class and a champion that wasn't meant to be natively bursty. That's tough to unwind. There might not be a way of doing it. Regardless, it is health growth, MP5 growth, and on hit damage, scaling with rank on the R to say, hey, you are better at longer term fighting. You're allowed to cast more Ws. You're allowed to stay out on the map and repeatedly use spells and use W for wave clear and trading, whatever. And so it's a lot of sort of slow burn Jax is better as the game goes on. Gets to be a solid scaling, moderately durable, pretty high damage skirmisher type champion. Nasus, very simple buff. Early increase with early lifesteal. This is a known lever. We've used it many times. It goes up and down as Nasus needs power to go up and down. Man, Nasus is better skewed towards early game with early lifesteal to survive his lane and keep his stacks going. Quinn is getting her old max rank 5 W attack speed back at 80%. Quinn is in one of these states where she's really hyper-focused on lethality burst builds. Her auto-attacking is kind of non-functional, or it's not very good overall, and so putting a lot of power back in the attack speed that got nerfed a few years back. I think there is a substantial amount of work that could be done to Quinn. It is, for example, weird that she maxes the reveal button because where her attack speed is held, right? There's kind of some strangeness there that maybe doesn't quite feel right. No one's doing any Quinn mid-scope work right now, but we know Quinn is kind of weird. Quinn is unpopular even for her, and there's, I think, just some flaws in the kit. This is not a promise of imminent work, but Quinn is definitely a champion that we know is not in the best spot, and I'm sorry to all the Quinn mains out there that your champion feels pretty bad. Hopefully these buffs feel decent. Hopefully your champion is at least balanced, even if there's probably still some wonkiness on the kit. I would love if we had time to get to Quinn at some point. I think she's a really cool champion, but as it is, this champion is deserving of buffs, and so here have some bonus attack speed to feel better about having a build other than just pure lethality burst, hopefully. Rakan is getting a buff. I believe personally that this is an underbuff, and there is not enough here for Rakan, but there are some very high-skilled support players who think this is a huge deal, so it's a light buff. It's also worth noting that Rakan already has a pretty moderate amount of pro presence, around 35%, which is actually very ideal. I would love if every pro champion had 35% presence. That's actually a really healthy sort of spread of games picked and banned. Regardless, though, This is 2 seconds off rank 1 W cooldown, flattening out to no change by rank 5. So this only matters levels 1 through 8, or 2 through 8, depending on what you start with. There are E starts, there are Q starts. Regardless, the consideration for like this is a big deal was that Rakan's primary constraint in laning phase is how often his W is up. And so if it's up about 15% more often, that's a really big deal and can do a lot for him. So maybe that's true. This also might, again, be a very, very small deal because it only matters level, 1.5 through 8. But regardless, this is a Rakan buff here. Again, has pro presence. He's about 1% underpowered by my measurement. So not a horrible champion, but here's a buff. Samira is in a weird space where if you look only at moderately experienced players, Samira is not weak. She is relatively difficult. She has a Callista Draven-like mastery curve where most AD carries are pretty easy to play. Kog'Maw's a straight line basically. Ashe is a straight line basically. Samira, if you're a skilled Samira player, is honestly a very normal level of powerful. Most Samira players, though, are very, very bad at Samira, and Samira is exceptionally punishing for players who are really bad at Samira. She is one of the lowest win rate, low mastery AD carries in the game, despite being very normal for high mastery AD carries. This results in Samira having a fairly low win rate. I can be convinced that Samira, just because her high mastery win rate is good, shouldn't be buffed. Ultimately, champion feels a little weak in sort of most player estimations. Again, I can't like give you all the exact reasons why this would be the case. Again, like pure dispassionate numbers say she's actually okay, but champion kind of feels bad. And so we're delivering her a pretty small buff. This is explicitly meant to be something that is not part of the normal, like, get your ult off in under a second and then go try to one-shot the enemy team. That is where a lot of her power budget is. It makes her kind of one note. It makes her quite feast or famine. It tends to be that feast or famine champions tend to not feel very good, even if they are numerically balanced among skilled players. That's a reason, for example. And so it's trying to give her a very small bit of fallback pattern where, yeah, some of this is just that she can be a good lane bully, but there are lane bullies out there and they feel fine. Draven's win rate is technically below 50 in most ELO brackets. No one thinks Draven's actually weak. Well, some people do. They're wrong. And so, yeah, this has some lane bully power because the E attack speed duration is going up from 3 seconds to 5 seconds. But it also says that, hey, I'm unable to hit the full combo off, or this is not the kind of situation where I can do a full combo, but at least I'm able to cast my dash to get some attack speed. Okay, well, that attack speed duration is 67% longer. That's not a ton of everything, but it's like, oh, here's an extra full auto attack. That's 400 damage. Congratulations. In some cases, your E does 400 more damage. 400 damage buff is a really big deal, right? And that's, again, in the case where it gives you exactly one auto attack, because you are using the duration, and you have enough AD late game for that to be the case. Obviously, it's not 400 damage at level 1, don't get me wrong. But this is meant to be a fairly meaningful buff to say that Samira has a bit more of a fallback pattern than simply perfect comboing and turning on R. Next up is Swain. Swain is in sort of net result from the mid-scope. He is more popular. His mid versus bot skew is closer, and he basically sustains a bigger player base per win rate than before, which is good. These are all things that say that, cool, the things we wanted to do were good. We seem to make changes that made people happy to play Swain, even though his build is this like weird Rylays into Fimbulwinter build, which I know is not like the most on-theme thing. There's two thoughts there. One, Fimbulwinter is just OP. I think the item is very overpowered. I kind of knew that when we made changes around it. I remember buffing it late, like mid to late last year, and then left it unnerfed when we did all the item nerfs in 0.19 because players weren't building this item, even though everything I could see said this item is very, very, very good. It's very strong. It's relatively unsatisfying. It is very hard to measure what your shield is doing. Of course, not a lot of champions need that much mana, but like, the item is kind of shattered. And so it's no surprise that anyone who's like, oh, I should build Fimbulwinter is doing really, really well because the item is kind of shattered. So Swain is one of these champions who's identified it, and Jace is the champion who's identified it. We might have enough pick rate on Fimbulwinter now that we can actually nerf the item. This is a very meaningful consideration that we might do in 0.4. We'll see. We'll have to investigate who needs compensation buffs as a result, but like, we know this item is like, at least I know the item is really, really OP. I think other designers on live are also in the same mindset. It's just, okay, is it correct to do it and do the compensation? Understand that players are like really slow to pick up items like this. We'll see. Anyway, room to buff Swain. So we are buffing the max health per stack. Swain should absolutely be a tanky champion. He is a battle mage that wants to surround himself with 5 enemies to maximize his ultimate. It's not like Crowstorm or Fiddlesticks or Kennen, where you dive in with R and pop Zonias and the duration ends and you're like, I did it. Or Karthus, where you're like, I'm just going to blow up and it's fine, I'll just ult afterwards. No, Swain needs to like actually survive this. So I want to be clear, Swain having tank items that are viable is working as intended. This champion is meant to succeed when sometimes it's building full durability, because that's what the game requires of him. Even in really, really high elo Swain mid games, Fimbulwinter builds are only equally as popular as building AP in every slot builds, and they're equally performant as well. So it's not like the only thing he does is build tank, but it being viable is kind of working as intended because of how much of a frontline battle mage he is, who again wants to surround himself with the enemy team and say, I can outdrain you, let's go. He's not meant to be like a Deathcap Zonia's Kennen kind of guy. That's just not that champion. Still though, to ensure that ability power remains a viable build for him, passive HP per stack is meant to be support skewed. It is relatively easier to land E when you're landing against a Nautilus than it is when you're facing off against Syndra or Yasuo or whatever. Generally speaking, true. Just the whole thing lines it better against a ranged champion being up against some caster minions and having 2 targets, right? Additionally, buffing the E ability power ratio. Again, both these are nudges toward him being allowed to build more AP because the health is a bit more covered by the passive and whatnot. And E appears to be a bit more of a support skewed skill. His support win rate is pretty bad. His mid win rate has a bit of room. His support has kind of a lot of room. And so trying to go for support skewed buffs, that makes sense for Swain and what I think he needs. Thresh is getting some simple buffs here. He's getting 20 flat HP. He's getting damage per soul and total AD ratio, like max total AD ratio when E is full charged, on his E passive. Essentially, we've seen that armor is not a very strong lever for Thresh, doesn't affect him very much. We don't want him to just stat check people, but we do want him to play that walk up and auto attack game with the E to give him some kind of cool consistent threat here. And so saying, here, Thresh, here you go. Go have some fun with this. Go be a cool guy using your autos to do some fun stuff there. So it should make Thresh a slightly better early game lane bully. I do think actually there is some work we could do to push Thresh to be a much more premier lane bully. I think he's maybe a little bit too much of a scaling pick, and we can actually make him a much stronger laner. And the tough thing is because he has so much optionality, right? E stuffs engages, Q can kill, ranged champions, W can get your AD carry to safety. If Thresh gets to the point where he can just stat check you, we get a really low gameplay lane here. But I don't think we're there right now. I think we have some room to move around. Again, not saying that work's going to happen anytime soon, but I think we could do some power shifts to Thresh and they would be reasonable. On to the nerfs. We are nerfing Cassiopeia. So one thing that I want to bring up is setting some kind of very light direction for live balance going forward. And to be clear, like this is in some cases going to be like 55-45. Like it's not going to be every time. It won't even be every patch. But I think broadly, live balance changes should tend to go after late game more often than not, and should tend to go after durability and damage in equal measure. And specifically when going after durability, to generally go after armor growth. I think armor growth has gotten so high that LDR is and things like Cyrildas are just generic damage items. I think it has gotten so high that it is very hard to play assassins, AD assassins in particular. AP assassins is a little bit more reasonable. And also because of how the game is architected, early game fights tend to be 1-on-1, 2-on-2, 3-on-3. Late game fights tend to be 5-on-5 or 5-on-1, where you're taking damage from 5 champions, and in order for these fights to feel pretty good, you have to somehow survive 5 champions, at least for enough to be able to comprehend what's going on. And if you get caught, you get caught, right? If Mouse Flash ults you, and the rest of the team dives in, they're meant to kill you. You're meant to die there. Don't get me wrong. But I think the explosiveness of late game is partially compounded by the fact that late games are kind of grouped up. And so the sort of way I think we're going to try to lean is to try to peel away late game damage from places that aren't really needed, to go after the damage front, and also to go after primarily things like armor growth and health growth when they're not needed either, in order to get rid of the first thing I said around lethality as a stat falling off and percent pen just being a generic damage multiplier when that's not really meant to be how it's really supposed to work, right? So what this comes down to is we will try patch for patch to be slightly more late game focused and equivalent in damage and durability to not specifically speed up or slow down the game on average, because I'm generally speaking relatively happy with combat pacing. Games with tanks in them have slower combat than games without tanks in them, and you're just going to see that. Yeah, that's basically the short of it. I'm going to kind of stop there and not go for too long in this one. So Cassiopeia is losing damage from things that she cares about less, right? The things Cassiopeia cares about are Twin Fang and maybe like some explosive, ult flash angles, right? So some AP ratio off Q and W. Neither Q nor W's rank ups are very strong. Their AP ratios, though, are actually pretty good overall. And so nerfing both the Q total AP ratio by 5% and the W AP ratio per second by 5%. Average champion takes about 1.5 seconds of W in most cases, so it's like maybe a, 7.5% AP ratio of W. Again, 5% AP ratio of Q. Not a ton, but this is, a moderate amount where damage comes from in places that are generally not going to be super exciting for her and reasonable for her to lose some of that there. Again, if the important thing is that she keeps Twin Fang on you, great. That's where the damage should be. We should make sure that remains powerful and feels really good. Cassiopeia also still has a pretty bad laning phase. I think we can go further on reshaping some of Cassiopeia's overall stuff. Reshaping her overall power budget. Worth noting that current Cassiopeia is lower win rate than Cassiopeia from 14.17, with a much higher play rate and seeming player enjoyment. So some of these power shifts have seemed to go pretty well in terms of making Cassiopeia feel like a more complete champion, feeling better overall. I think there is still more work to do. Don't get me wrong. I think there is a fair bit of relatively low scope reshaping that could be done to make Cassiopeia feel better in lane and better in lane. And just get some kind of free, small siphoning off of late game, because you can just kind of get that for free. You don't lose a lot of win rate per late game power taken away, but you can have actually some really meaningful gains in terms of how the game feels overall. Next change, though, is to Galio. This is basically, we are going for early game this one. It's flat HP off of Galio. The call here is that Galio feels a bit too immovable in the early game, a bit too generic. Force Health is a fairly generic nerf, but hey, the less generically durable he is, the more he has to rely on that MR shield, right? So it's a simple nerf here to Galio, with him feeling fairly immovable, understanding that he's going for Sunfire Cape and, or I always want to call it Moon Ice Apron, because that was the name for months internally, Hollow Radiance. But yeah, basically, understanding that he always builds health early on, he can stand to lose a little bit there. It's going to be okay. Jace, this is actually more of an adjustment than a strict nerf. It is meant to be a strict nerf to tank Jace. We are taking some base damage off of the rank ups of both Qs and his W and the R base damage, and buffing the bonus AD ratios of both Qs and the R bonus damage. This is meant to be equivalent at around 2 items, roughly. Obviously, if we get the numbers wrong and AD Jace sucks, we'll just buff Jace. If we get it wrong, we'll buff him in 0.4. It will not be hard to measure. We can very easily track what his Eclipse Cleaver win rate is compared to before the patch and be like, oh, Eclipse Cleaver is down 0.5%. Okay, we'll give you 0.5%. Here you go, buddy. Have fun. If it's doing better than before, we're probably okay with that. If it's doing equally, okay, great. And again, we can totally nerf Fimbulwinter. That's totally fine, but that's the change here. It is meant to be neutral to AD Jace and a just strict nerf to the Cleaver Fimbulwinter Jace build. Misfortune is losing 3 base armor and 0.2 armor growth. This puts her at 25 plus 4.0 armor growth. If I could snap my fingers and we could fast forward 300 balance changes, I would try to put, by the end of 2025, every squishy ranged champion at about that level of armor. I would want to bring that down further in the next year to about 3.5 armor growth, which is where Jinx was before the durability update. That is my target for champions long term, which is 85 armor at 18. That is the long term target, which is 2 years away. Don't get me wrong. And we might even get there because other things might show up, or I'm wrong about this. And it's oh crap, actually reverse course. We didn't think about something here. All these things are possible, right? But it is an opinion that has been floated around a lot. People are on board, and so we're kind of generally moving in that direction. But again, because I don't want people to go back to Rocket Tag in late game, we have to also compensate damage where is needed. Anyway, MF going down to 25 plus 4, and hoping to get more champions in that space long term. Speaking of that, Rel is losing some flat HP and losing some armor growth here. So again, peeling back some armor growth. Worth noting that Rel is very unique in this regard. I think she's going down to also 4.0 flat armor growth. The thing is, though, she gets 15% more total armor in in dismounted form, and 15% of 4 is 6, or 0.6, I should say. So when dismounted, she has 4.6 armor growth, which is actually on the slight high end for my in 2 years tank armor growth rubric here. Her level 1 armor ends up being, in the mid 30s there as well. Her MR lines it pretty much perfectly, and she also prints more armor via her passive. So if she's dismounted, she should have some of the highest armor in the game by poking somebody and getting the multiplication. When she is dismounted, she's meant to be low on average and feel more like she's got skirmish levels of durability, while still getting some steel, and acknowledging that like there's meant to be a pretty big difference from better than a normal tank to worse than a normal tank, almost skirmisher level, and go back and forth between those two. Base health is a relatively easy lever that we know is pretty reasonable. I don't think Rel's armor growth should go any lower for the next roughly year at this point, and again relying on her passive for that. But again, 20 HP off is meant to be a 1% or so win rate. Rel is definitely the best support in the game. In both pro play and solo queue, almost across MMRs. So, hey, there's some room to go down. Rel's is doing too well overall. Next up is Skarner, and would you look at that armor growth going down again? Skarner going down to, I believe, 4.5, which, again, I think is a pretty reasonable number and where I would want most tanks to end up long term as we, move things along. Also lowering his stun duration by, I forget if we're going to 1.0 or 1.1. I'd have to double check. But essentially, if you have no tenacity, and even with Merc Treads, E into R is basically a full combo and will still be true. If you have more tenacity, this will now break. But the optimization that skilled players have is, actually, I have a half second to do whatever I want here, so I can E into the wall, auto W, then start R, and it was a full combo and I do it the whole time. Because the R cast time is 0.65. You have like almost a full second, actually. You have a lot of time to do stuff. And optimizations like that aren't necessarily a problem. It's not wrong to have optimizations, but Skarner is consistently still a champion who is very hard to play, has a lot of optimizations. I mean, he's hard to learn because his E is such a unique skill that we are explicitly pulling back a little bit of what we think is pro skewed power, because pros have put into practice to do these combos and the sequencing appropriately. And it's the kind of nerf that like your average Skarner player is Eing into R anyway and doesn't feel this whatsoever. And so a lot of Skarner players will not have this nerf literally at all. It won't do anything to them, but it will have a more meaningful impact in Elite Solo Queue, where he's over sort of seen, I guess, and also Pro Play, where he is, to be fair, the best jungler in the game. What's funny is I'm really happy that we have like good advanced like mastery win rate tracking stuff, is that I know for sure that Skarner, Wukong, and Viego are in fact the 3 best junglers in the game, if you know how to play them. And Viego is like moderately difficult, Wukong is very easy, and Skarner is quite hard. And lo and behold, Wukong's win rate's up here, Viego's win rate's around here, and Skarner's win rate's around here, if you look at most League of Legends players, despite the fact that they're all actually the best. And that's what you actually see when you look at Elite Solo Queue. These are the champs they actually play, because they are actually the best champions in the game, and the better players are better at understanding that and seeing the potential of a champion. But like, yeah, they are actually the 3 best junglers in the game. We should nerf all 3 of them, and we are, for example, but yeah, it's worth noting. So trying to bring Skarner down to a more reasonable level. Okay, great. Next up is Teemo. So Teemo, we're simply nerfing his lane bullying. I think there are a lot of things we could do for Teemo nerfs overall. I think there's a lot of ways we could shift his kit over time. The designer here chose early game bully power. This is -5 on hit damage at rank 1, -1 on hit damage at rank 5. This is just meant to be about 1% win rate here, lowering his lane bullying. Okay, fine. Viego is -3 flat AD. This, I believe, from the designer's mind, was meant to be a little bit more elite skewed, since early game nerfs tend to be, tend to be more important in higher MMRs. And so trying to nerf Viego more in elite, very understandable there. Not much to say. It's going to be a bit over 1% win rate. Viego, definitely one of the strongest performers, and yeah, worthy of a pretty big nerf here. The final nerf is Wukong. These are pretty much reverts of 2 fairly recent buffs that we identified were both pretty strongly jungle skewed. We've been having a battle for a while of trying to get Wukong top into viability without getting Wukong jungle to super overpowered. And things we noticed were that W's, when we made W better to not have it be like correct to max second and let him max E, but by doing that, we just like buffed his W cooldown a whole bunch. And we also had a fairly recent change to his E attack speed to just give him a better long-term sustained pattern. Both of those, I guess, kind of unsurprisingly in retrospect, were very strongly jungle skew. That we can very easily track win rate by role, patch over patch, and look at a lot of patches in a row to make sure it wasn't variant. And it's like, oh no, the patch where we buffed W cooldown was pretty strongly jungle skewed. The patch where we buffed E attack speed along with like base mana, which would never affect the jungle anyway, that patch was still jungle skewed. And we're like, oh okay, well we'd like to keep top Wukong where we can. We'd like to nerf jungle Wukong. He's top 3 junglers in the game. Okay, well, let's go back on levers that we know are going to be effective, that we know are jungle skewed. Here we go, easy change here. And that's the patch. We got it in 35 minutes. Got through every single change here. See you next time. Bye-bye.